Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit about backyard composting. I'm really excited to be giving this presentation today. As just mentioned, my name is Delana Arnold. I'm the Education Programs Manager with the Georgian Bay Biosphere, and I'm not afraid to say that I'm very passionate about backyard composting. It's so important. I could talk about it endlessly, but I'm going to stick to at least just an hour today. I'm a big time gardener. I love everything related to outdoors, to plants, to food. Yeah, and I think we're going to have a great discussion and hopefully learn a little bit about composting today. Zoom is letting me know that my internet is unstable, so I actually might just turn my camera off if I can do that, just to make sure I don't cut out on anyone. So today, this is just a little snapshot of the presentation I'm going to provide this morning. We're going to start a little bit about why composting, just a little bit to touch on that topic. The majority of people who signed up for the webinar today actually indicated that they were new to backyard composting or had done it before and stopped and were looking to restart. So I am going to focus a little bit on getting started. We're going to review the basics of that. And I think there's some valuable information in there that even if you already are composting, it might be a helpful little refresher. We're going to have tips and troubleshooting information for people who are already composting, as well as those getting started. There's sections on those things on tips and troubleshooting, but it's also going to be scattered throughout the entire presentation. So the core messages today and some of the lists and examples you'll see are from the Biosphere's little Composting 101 guide. When you signed up for the webinar, you had the option to receive a little package in the mail, and that guide was in it. Don't fret though if you did not receive that package, if you didn't sign up for it. We are going to send a link to the online version, which you can download and use or print and put on your fridge, whatever you'd like. We'll have some other resources we'll send as well. And of course, we are recording, so you'll receive that link in the follow-up email. So to get us started, when I say the word compost, what comes to mind first? I'd like you to share in the chat with everybody, if you're comfortable, the first word that you think of, and just perhaps you could share some of them out loud with everyone.
So decomposition. Worms. I would say dirt. I didn't type it in yet. Dirt. Scraps.
Nice.
Organics.
Those are good words. My word is earth. That's the word I think of first. So obviously we're all coming to compost, the idea of composting from some different perspectives, and that's totally okay. Another word that I think of right away when I think of compost is habit, because managing a compost, really similar to the different strategies for addressing food waste, like we talked about last week, and frankly, so many other things that we do, it's about building good habits. So at first, if you're getting started, it might take a bit of thought. It will take maybe a touch of planning, but over time, that gets a lot easier. It comes more naturally, and eventually you just do it out of routine. You don't have to think about it. Another note, throughout the presentation, you might hear me say organic waste all the time. That's just simply referring to both the food and the yard waste that you might put in the compost. If you hear organic waste, if that's a new term, that's just what I'm talking about. Like I said, I do want to touch on why compost? Why are we talking about it? Because it's actually a big deal. I won't spend a lot of time here, but if you're listening to the presentation, you probably are already aware that this is important, but because I do want to mention it, because I think it's helpful to consider the larger picture beyond our households and actually the big impact that we can collectively have through composting. When we throw something away at home, This is what I always ask people, especially young kids. Where did it go? Where is away, right? For us, it goes to a landfill. Inevitably, that's where all of our waste ends up. Organic waste actually makes up at least 1/3 of all of our household waste and sometimes more. So if we can keep organic waste out of the trash and therefore out of landfills, it lowers the total amount of waste each family, then community, city, even country produces. And this is super important. A landfill is not a bottomless pit. It has a lifespan. It will eventually run out of room for all that waste. So when we keep organic waste out, we're not taking up unnecessary space. We're extending the life of each landfill. This saves everyone money in the long run and has a ton of other environmental benefits too. There's actually a misconception that when we throw organic waste in the garbage, when it ends up in the landfill, it simply breaks down the way it would in your backyard. And this isn't actually the case. A different process happens, which brings me to big deal number 2, greenhouse gases or GHGs. Greenhouse gases, you might have heard this term before. It's gases that are produced by human activity that ultimately contribute to climate change. Take a deep breath in and let it out. That was carbon dioxide. It's the GHG that we're probably most familiar with. In a landfill, our little bacteria friends who do the breaking down or the decomposition work for us, they actually don't get oxygen when they're buried under a mountain of waste. So what happens to that organic waste in a landfill when it's buried, instead of decomposing into soil, it actually contributes methane gas production. And methane gas is another greenhouse gas. It's actually 25 times as potent as carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. So in 1 year, the organic waste from a household of 4 people will release more GHGs than a car does. And if that organic waste is composted instead, then the bacteria, they'll get oxygen and they'll turn our waste into a really useful soil product instead, and therefore release less GHGs. Which brings me to the third point, speaking of soil, which is healthy soil and water. In today's modern agriculture, the way we essentially feed the world, we've been using more and more human-made or artificial fertilizers. Not just using these fertilizers, but making them and moving them around also releases a lot of harmful greenhouse gases. The fertilizers are then washed away with rains, and they end up in lakes and rivers, and as we're probably familiar, they can even cause toxic algae blooms. Compost is the original fertilizer. Finished compost is earth, and we're simply returning it to the soil. So unlike artificial fertilizers, compost will actually build the overall health of the soils. It feeds the small but mighty little ecosystems of bacteria and worms and fungus and all kinds of other organisms that make up what I call your soil biome. Healthy soil can actually trap and hold GHGs too. Plus, compost-rich soils hold water better. So in your garden, that translates to meaning less time watering and less water used overall. In case that hasn't sold you on it, there's a number of other reasons. These are bonus reasons. It's absolutely easy to do for any age. You require no special skills whatsoever, no technical knowledge. It's affordable. It could even be free, really, if you don't use a bin. If you just have a pile of compost, that can also be effective. And technically, you've already paid for all of the input materials. We don't think of it, but we buy compost, or we buy banana peels, we buy apple cores, we buy all the things that we don't eat. So really, let's get the most out of our money, right? It's for gardeners, it's good for your gardens and your plants. Like I mentioned about building that soil biome. Plant health starts with the soil. You'll find you'll have healthier and even more productive plants. We mentioned the water issue, so it will hold water better. And I think that's especially important as we notice these warmer and warmer summers that we're having. And finally, it's just super satisfying. If you think of something that you've done or created that you were really proud of, like I think of the last loaf of bread that I baked and I pulled it out of the oven and I was like, this is a good one. That feeling is what you get when you pull out this sweet smelling, crumbly brown earth that at one time was your compost. It's just a really extraordinary feeling. So how do we get started? If you're new to composting, if you've stopped and you want to restart, the very first thing that I think we should think about is location. Where does it go? And the number one thing here is actually convenience. Some people don't want to look at their compost, and they might end up putting it, in the back 40 of their property. Well, you're never going to use it. If you have to walk over 100 meters to your compost, chances are you'll use it less. It's just an inconvenience to you. So try to keep it somewhere close by. You also want it to receive some sunlight. It's not a tomato plant. It doesn't need, 8 hours a day. In fact, it could actually dry out too quickly, especially if you have a black bin. But you do want it to get a little bit. You could strategically put it near a deciduous tree so that it gets more sun in the winter and then dappled or part sun during the days. But that's going to depend on your property and your site location, essentially. You definitely want it to be somewhere where it won't sit in a puddle. Drainage is important. And you do want it set back a little from nearby buildings. You wouldn't want it leaning up against any kind of structure, partly because, it's going to be decomposing. It will leave a mark. But also you want airflow around it as much as possible. And here's an important tip too. Think of your line of sight when you're accessing the compost. This relates to the fact that we're in bear country. I'm going to bring this up again later on, but you don't want to leave your compost around a corner where maybe you can't see it until the last minute. You don't want to startle anybody who's also enjoying your compost with you. Once you have a spot picked out on your property, it's time to think about style, the different looks for your compost. And there's many different shapes and sizes. Some are expensive. They might put a dent on your credit card. Some are just DIY projects with free or low cost materials. You could even have some of this stuff lying around already. And like I mentioned before, it could just be a pile. It doesn't actually need 4 walls to work. When you think of style, there's a couple considerations as well. So one is going to be the volume of organics that you're producing. Are you a single person household? Are you a family of 5? Do you have extensive gardens, or do you have plans to build extensive gardens? If you do, you might actually want more than one compost bin, and I'll come back to this later, but it is a good idea for most people to actually have more than one compost bin. You want to think about wildlife. Does your neighbor, for instance, have problems with wildlife? Are you close to a landfill? Or do you see wildlife frequently? Has wildlife got into your garbage before? Do you feed the birds all summer long? Because sometimes that can attract raccoons and bears as well. Think about aesthetics. It's really okay to think about what you like the look of. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's black bins, there's green bins, there's pallet gardens. They don't all appeal to everybody equally. And also experimenting, because there's so many variables in style and location and what you're going to put in it. Trying different things as much as possible to find your best fit is a good idea. You might not actually know what you like until you try it. And again, here's a top tip. Bigger isn't actually better. And I'll mention this again later on. But know that a really big pile of compost is going to be hard for you to manage. If you have 10 feet tall and 10 feet wide. One of the things you're going to need to do to your compost is stir, which I'll talk about soon. And it's going to be really hard to do that with a massive pile of compost. So about 3 by 5 feet is sort of the ideal size. On this slide, there's just a bunch of different examples of style. Cinder blocks is also an option. In the bottom right, you see that there's a chain link fence that's used. Those aren't even pallets. Those are just boards with metal corners, and then all kinds of different styles. My personal preference after some experimentation is for any compost that actually touches the ground. I do sometimes find that the ones that are lifted up off the ground, I have found them less effective in my own personal experience, and maybe that's not for everybody, but I think there's something to be said about actually touching the ground and, worm and bacteria and fungus access right from the ground. Like I mentioned before, you should probably have more than one, no matter the volume of compost that you produce. So, maybe pick your top two to start with. Another point on size too, if they're too small, or there's not enough things being added to them, they might actually not get enough. They might not get hot enough to decompose properly, or bacteria need a warm environment, and that heat is going to kill any seeds and things like that and pathogens in the compost. So not too big, not too small, somewhere in the middle. Once you've got your location and you've picked maybe your top two styles to start with, it's time to start caring for your compost. And I recommend to people that this is where you start to think of it maybe as a bit of a family pet. I've heard people do this for other things like houseplants or your sourdough starter. And I think it can actually be a pretty effective mindset because your compost needs roughly the same things. To start with, it's going to need some attention, some love, and we do that by stirring the pot. This is the number one most important thing you can do, is to stir it. And I recommend once a week, maybe every other week, but pretty regularly is the take-home message. Mixing and stirring, what that does is it breaks up clumps. It allows you to check it to make sure that it's the right level of dampness. And most importantly, it infuses it with oxygen. You're making sure that oxygen gets into the middle, because remember, that's what keeps it decomposing and not rotting. So by stirring it, that's the best way that you're going to keep smells down. And overall, it actually helps to speed the process up. My top tip here is just to simply keep a shovel or a pitchfork right beside your bin. I actually have a broken shovel that I keep beside my bin. It's got a new life as my compost stirrer, and it works perfectly. I never have to go back to the house having forgotten one and go find one again. Just leave one there, dedicate it to the compost. You won't regret it. In addition to stirring the pot, your compost family pet needs water like anyone else. You want to make sure that it's got kind of the right amount, not too much, not too little. Too much will drown your compost, your bacteria, and too little will make it hard for them to live as well. So what you're looking for is enough water, like a wrung out sponge. If you squeezed it, you'd get a drop or two of water coming out. When you're stirring it regularly, it's going to allow you to check the water level. If it's really sticky, just by looking at it, you would know that there's a lot of water. If it's really crumbly, again, it's probably too dry. You don't actually have to touch it if you don't want to. So the black bins in the heat of the summer especially might need a bit of a dump of a bucket of water, or maybe a spray with a hose occasionally. And again, a tip, think of water availability when you're thinking about the location options as well. Can my hose reach this spot, or is there a creek or something maybe within a couple of meters that I could walk to and scoop a bucket of water out of? And then, of course, you're going to feed your compost as well. Ultimately, feeding the compost comes down to two things, two different types of organic waste. There's your greens, which make up your nitrogen, and your browns, which make up your carbon. And the key to a successful compost is to have a balance of these. And I say 40-60. Other resources online, if you're doing research, you might see 50-50. Chances are you're not going to measure it anyway. So aim for about half and half, and you're probably on the right track. If you have kids, I think this is one of the best ways or strategies to get kids involved in composting. Don't make it a chore, you make it feeding time for the compost, and make sure that they see that end result later on and explore it with you, because not only do we want everyone composting, we want everyone composting for life, right? So building these lifelong composters, just by using a strategy like feeding time, I think is really effective. Those greens and the browns, what are they? So here's some examples. Again, this list is right out of our Composting 101 guide that you'll receive. So you'll have this list at the end. And quite simply, your browns and your greens. So your greens are going to be a lot of what comes out of your kitchen, your table scraps, your fruit and your veggie scraps, but also grass clippings actually make up green, and tea leaves and coffee grounds. Those are all your nitrogens. Your browns, wonderfully enough, come free to you in the form of fallen leaves primarily, which is excellent. But you can also use newspaper, any non-glossy paper. You could use sawdust. Straw is actually a good one. One of the common themes that you'll see, it's kind of written on a couple of these points on the list, is that it works better when it's chopped up. So no matter what you're going to put in, the smaller the bits you put in, the better overall. The easier and the faster it will decompose. And a few things to note on this list. So wood ash is on the brown list. You don't want to use a lot of ash. It can affect the pH of your compost, and you don't want to play with that. So just a sprinkle is lots. Under the greens at the bottom of the list, it says weeds, but only if they're not gone to seed. So for instance, if you cut your grass and you're going to add your lawn clippings, consider if your dandelions were in flower or not, for instance. If you're not sure, or if there's a strong likelihood that there is weed seeds, that's when you might want to use that other compost bin. If you have one dedicated to weed seeds and perhaps diseased plants from your garden, just keeping them separate from the households. Some composts, when they're working really effectively, they will get hot enough that those seeds will decompose. That's not always the case though. So you don't want to be counterproductive and seed your gardens. And then a note on the leaves too. So pine needles are there, they're acidic. So again, don't use too many. But the best leaves to use are ash, maple, fruit tree leaves if you've got them, poplar, and willow. I believe it's oak. If you have a lot of oak on your property, it can be heavy in tannins or something like that. That can also have an effect on your compost. However, I would say, that's not a rule. That's more like a guideline to consider. If all you had was oak or something that wasn't on the list, you might not use as many of those leaves. If you have a good mix, I wouldn't worry about it quite as much. A former colleague of mine, she had a lot of pine needles and maybe some oak. Whatever was on her property, she didn't want to use it exclusively for her compost. So she would actually grab some of the bags of leaves that people put out at the end of their driveway in the fall. And if she saw that they had maple trees and poplars on their property, she knew that they were good to use for her compost. I'm not recommending that, but you get what you need to do what you have to do. So there are lots of maple trees around, and your neighbors might be supportive of it as well. So hopefully you don't have 100% pine or oak, and you can get some variety in your leaves. Equally important is what stays out of your compost. And if you look at this list, you'll notice that they have one thing in common, essentially. They're things that you would not grow in your garden or things you would not buy in the produce section of the grocery store. So meat, any kind of meat, fish, bones, any kind of fats or greases or oils, any dairy, any carbs, none of that stuff. And the reason is there's no way that it won't smell. There's no way that it won't attract wildlife when it's in your compost. Pet waste from dogs and cats, including cat litter. So very possible to contain pathogens that would not break down in your compost. Simply not a good idea. Diseased plants and weeds with mature seeds. I guess you do grow those in your garden, if you're me, but you want to keep them separate. You can still compost them. This would be a good opportunity even for just a pile instead of purchasing or building a bin for those kinds of things. And then, of course, chemically treated wood. Interestingly, walnut shells contain a chemical that's toxic to other plants, and you'll find they're not recommended in large quantities in your compost. Very similar to the leaves. Like if you had walnuts in your diet, if you were shelling them every day, yes, I would avoid putting them in your compost. If you buy the nuts around Christmas time and that's the only time, I wouldn't necessarily be super worried about that. It's a bit of a judgment call on your part. But just know that they do contain that chemical that's toxic. And then, of course, obviously personal care products and plastics. All right, so that was sort of getting started and then feeding it and providing care. We're going to get into a couple top tips now. And number one, importantly, remember that composting actually starts in your kitchen, in your house. And so you want to think of the kitchen pail. You can purchase a kitchen pail. There's many options, some of which are very cute on the market. You can reuse something. My mom uses this old enamel soup pot, and it's very charming. The idea is, though, that you want a tight-fitting lid, and some of the ones you buy actually have charcoal filters built right into the lid. So that's great because it's aerating it without allowing a lot of smell. That's going to help prevent fruit flies and other insects in your kitchen too, that tight-fitting lid. My number one recommendation here in the kitchen, though, is actually keeping it cool. Last summer, I started keeping my compost pail in the fridge, and I've never taken it out. Well, that's not true. When I empty it, I take it out, but that's where it lives now, in the fridge, right beside my vegetable crispers. I see it when I go to grab produce. The fridge obviously keeps things from smelling for much longer. It's not on my counter attracting fruit flies. I've also heard of people keeping it in their freezer, which is a good idea as well, because it gives it a little bit of a leg up in decomposition, but keeping it cool really does make a big difference. If you have a metal, a plastic, an enamel bin, every time you empty it, whatever your routine is when you're dumping it out once every week or two, take it back and wash it as well. Inevitably, things will build up on the inside, and they're not going to decompose in that little bin. They're going to rot, and it'll stink. It'll be gross, and eventually it'll get hard to clean. So washing it pretty frequently is also a good strategy to help. We mentioned this earlier on, but chopping up large or tough bits into smaller, more manageable pieces is a good way to help your compost out. Like this picture, when I was looking for some pictures, I have a whole pumpkin in there. And I think that might be a worm compost because it's in the bin. But, if you're putting your jack-o'-lanterns in your compost, consider chopping them up a little bit more than that. Similarly, like watermelon rinds, if they're not already cut into slices, if you have an entire vegetable that might have spoiled, or sometimes certain peels of different produce can be particularly tough. As I mentioned, freezing your compost will really help to break it down. And on the note of freezing, you can freeze certain types of veggie scraps and use them to make soup stock. And that process of making soup stock will actually further soften and break down your vegetable scraps before it even goes in the compost, which is helpful. And you're going to be reaping even more from your food investment. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Did I say soup stock? Yep. So things you can put in a pot to make stock are pretty obvious, really: onion, garlic, carrot, celery, all kinds of your herb stems. If you're just pulling the leaves off, the stems are still good. Mushroom stems I have found excellent, and small amounts of bell pepper. A few things you want to avoid are your brassicas, right? So your cabbage, your broccoli, cauliflower, and Brussels sprouts. They will leave a bitter flavor. And then anything that's really starchy, potatoes and turnips especially, they'll cloud your soup stock. If you're going to make potato soup anyway, it probably doesn't matter. But if you're not, something to consider. All you have to do is keep these separate in your freezer until you have a pot's worth full. Throw them in the pot, cover with water, bring to a boil, simmer for 30 minutes, season to taste. Not instant, but there's your stock. I've done this a few times. It is different every time, obviously, but it definitely works. I've also tried it in the slow cooker, and I found that a little less effective personally. I think the slow cooking brought out some of the bitter flavors even in these, but something to keep experimenting with. My next trial will probably be with an Instapot and see if that works. So pre-compost soup stock. Another tip, never stop feeding it. I get some questions about feeding it in the winter, and you can, and in fact you should. So the first note, the more you add, the hotter it will get. So that comes back to saving up all of your scraps for a week or two at a time, and then adding a pile like that, instead of going out every day with little bits. The idea is when you add larger meals, when you feed it larger meals, you're creating more interior space at one time to heat up. So that's not a crucial strategy, but it is just a little bit of a tip that might help. Winter is a great time to keep adding because it'll naturally freeze without you having to freeze it. So it'll soften whatever you've added and give it a helping hand. What you might do though is give it a bunch of leaves, because you want to keep that balance of greens and browns, right? So in the fall, put some extra leaves in there, give it a really good stir, because you're going to be adding greens all winter long. So you're preemptively taking care of it and making sure it'll be balanced by the spring. And another note for the winter is actually not to stir it. I think composting gets easier in the winter because you don't want to stir it and let the heat out. You want your bacteria to stay warm and well insulated. Some people put straw bales around or hay bales around to help insulate it as well. That I would say that's optional in a winter like we just had. It's not going to make it worse though. But yeah, not stirring it until the spring when it starts to thaw, and then give it a good stir. Next is about having some patience, because composting is a process. And this is where it comes back to being a good idea to have more than one. I love this picture where you can see they've got a great setup with 3 bins to put their compost in. And what's happening is you want to let your compost finish decomposing without continually adding more. The more you add, you're never really going to get ahead, right? So 3 is actually pretty common, and then you do on a 3-year basis. But finished compost can be done in 1 year. So if you had 2 compost bins, that would also work. But really you want to fill one, make sure it's balanced, and then move on to the next so that it can finish while continuing to stir it and checking the moisture. The actual length of time it's going to take for you will vary a little bit. It could be 6 months, it could be a little over a year, but really that depends on where you live, the conditions, what you're putting into it, and so on. So when it's done, it will be a really deep brown black color with a really sweet earthy smell. It's a really lovely product, and you won't recognize it from what you put in. And don't forget to use it too. Use it in the garden. Some people use it mostly in the spring and fall. It's really easy to use. You can apply it as a mulch to your plants. You just put it right on top of the soil. You can stir it in, or you can just use it as mulch. That's fine too. If you don't have gardens, you can use it for some of your container plants. You could use it for your flower beds. You can even use it for trees. And as a gardener, I can say, if you want to just give it away to other people that garden, we are always happy to accept compost. So no matter what, there will be a home for it. And then finally, avoiding wildlife. We want to avoid wildlife. Sometimes it's challenging. So, we live in bear country. We have to think about this. Wildlife is going to be attracted to the smell of your compost. With proper care, everything we've done today, your compost shouldn't be a bear or wildlife attractant, because it shouldn't have those strong smells if it's stirred frequently, if it's decomposing properly. However, you might know this about bears is they're pretty smart. And the same kind of thing applies if you've heard people that work at parks, and they talk about bears recognizing coolers. Once a bear has learned that a cooler holds food, they will go up to an empty cooler, just sheer recognition. And that can be what happens to black compost bins. Once a bear learns that it's got a meal out of it once or a few times, it's always going to recognize it. So it does make things a little tricky for us, but we're still going to manage it correctly. And some other tips would be to avoid putting large quantities of fruit all at one time. Like if you're canning or making applesauce or relish or something like that, or if you've got a big garden harvest that you're freezing down, You might want to space out how much you add at one time to your compost, because those large additions of good smelling things are obviously going to be a big attractant. Some other things you can do to help avoid wildlife in the first place is also about other things on your property. So if you have meat or dairy going into your garbage, don't let that be a wildlife attractant either. You want to deal with it really quickly, maybe keep it indoors, in the garage, whatever you need to do. You want to, of course, not place your compost close to a door. Remember what we said about that line of sight and having it away from a building. Some other things, if you have a bird feeder, if you're feeding the birds throughout the summer, that is hanging bear bait. Bears can actually smell birdseed from a mile or two away. And another thing to do is not to check with your neighbors. Sometimes it's actually not you attracting the bears or the other wildlife. Are your neighbors managing their garbage properly? Do your neighbors feed the birds? And they don't have to be right next door to you too. It could be somebody just in your area. Your property might have just been, something an animal would walk through. But because they're on their way somewhere else, they notice that you also have something that they're interested in. So if there is a bear or other wildlife poking around and you have to do something now, we're no longer past avoiding it, we're trying to get rid of it. I haven't tried this, but what I've read is really effective is to soak a rag in ammonia and then leave it in a plastic bucket right beside the compost. You're stirring your compost, you're making sure that it's not rotting, it's got the smell is managed, so that the bear's sensitive noses are actually going to be repelled by the ammonia smell. It's not going to be overpowered by the compost, and that should help them to stay away. You're going to want to replace that ammonia rag every 2 to 3 weeks and continue to just manage that compost pile, add a bunch of browns if you can, and with time and a little patience, the bears are not going to be interested. If you come across a bear on your property, you also want to make that a bit of an unpleasant experience for it, obviously without getting close to it. Making noise is a really good way to do that. Yelling, banging pots together. You just want it to not enjoy being on your property and less likely to return because of that. Worst case scenario, you might have to take a little break from composting. You might have to take down your compost bin, or you might have to try a different style. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just another way of troubleshooting, and it's still going to be worth it at the end to take care, to be able to compost on your property. So that's sort of some tips and some troubleshooting, and here's some more troubleshooting. This chart is actually directly from the Biosphere's Composting One-on-One guide. So this is another resource that you'll have at the end of our time together. We'll be sure to send it out in a follow-up email. The really important message here is like composting works. It definitely is effective and it definitely can be done right. So if there is one of these problems, it's just a matter of troubleshooting, of tweaking it and getting back on track. For instance, if it has a smell to it, it's just about balance. Ammonia usually means too much nitrogen. Rotten eggs, that's that methane smell. It needs more oxygen. It needs to be stirred. If your pile is too wet and not hot enough, you can try adding some sawdust or something like that to absorb some of that wetness. You could try leaving the lid off too if it's one of those black bins, because that'll help the water evaporate. If nothing's happening, it could be another issue of balance. It could be that the compost maybe is too small as well, and you have to add a bunch of something like brown leaves or, pile up some kitchen scraps. If you're finding too many insects or animals pestering it, that could be a case of odor as well, or perhaps the wrong materials might have been added. Maybe you had company over and they took some meat out there or something like that. So again, an easy strategy. The first strategy I would say when you're troubleshooting is always just start with leaves or straw and keep it well turned, well stirred. All right, so to recap, composting is amazing. It's really important. It keeps organic waste out of the landfill. It reduces greenhouse gas and improves soil health. Composting is super easy to do and really affordable to start. And all your compost really needs, like any family pet, a balanced diet, water, sunlight, and some attention through stirring. So this has been our presentation, and I'm happy to turn things over to the questions now.